The late afternoon sun, usually a flamboyant spectacle in the Floridian sky, now hung like a tired, bruised orange above the sprawling expanse of horizon west. Its once brilliant rays struggled to penetrate the humid haze, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched like skeletal fingers across the immaculately polished pavement leading to the Gilded Spoon. This wasn't just another restaurant, it was an architectural statement, a testament to opulence and exclusivity, its facade a gleaming mosaic of dark wood, polished brass, and floor-to-ceiling glass that reflected the fading light with an almost arrogant indifference. From within, the delicate, almost symphonic clinking of cutlery against fine porcelain drifted out, mingling with the low, sophisticated murmur of polite conversation, a continuous hum of privilege that seemed to mock the very air Amara breathed. Amara, her frame slender but stooped with an exhaustion that ran bone-deep, stood on the periphery of this gleaming world. Her sari, once a vibrant burst of saffron, a color as sacred and hopeful as the first dawn in her homeland, was now faded, its intricate embroidery softened by countless washes and endless journeys. It hung loosely around her, a last, fragile whisper of a life left far behind. Every crease in the fabric, every threadbare patch, told a silent story of perseverance, of miles walked and battles fought, none of which had been won with ease. Her eyes, usually pools of deep, knowing wisdom, held the stark, raw hunger of 1,000 unmet needs, sharpened by the gnawing worry for the small hand tucked into hers. Beside her, little Ravi, no older than 6, a child whose world had, until recently, been painted in the vibrant hues of open fields and sun-drenched laughter, now clung to a threadbare stuffed tiger. The toy, missing an eye and frayed at the seams, was his constant companion, a silent witness to their dwindling hopes. Ravi's small face, typically bright and curious, was etched with a profound hunger, a quiet ache that resonated deeply within Amara's soul. He hadn't complained, not once, but the tightness of his grip on her sari, the way his little stomach rumbled faintly, was a far more eloquent plea than any words could be. They had been walking for what felt like an eternity, the relentless asphalt burning through the thin soles of Amara's sandals. Each step had been a silent prayer, a desperate calculation, as she navigated this labyrinth of gleaming glass and indifferent concrete. She had heard whispers of the Gilded Spoon, tales of its exquisite food, its influential patrons, its air of untouchable luxury. It was a place where, perhaps, in the vastness of its abundance, a simple act of charity, a moment of respite, might be found. A meal, any meal, that could quell the insistent, desperate gnaw of their empty stomachs. The scent of roasting herbs, rich and tantalizing, drifted from the restaurant's open doors, mixing with the sharp tang of expensive wine. It was a perfume of plenty, a stark contrast to the stale air and exhaust fumes that had been their constant companions. Amara closed her eyes for a fleeting second, drawing in a shaky breath, trying to summon a strength she no longer possessed. This was it. This was their last hope for the day. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of desperation. Taking a deep, fortifying breath that tasted of both fear and an unyielding will, Amara pushed open the heavy glass door. The delicate, almost musical chime above her head, designed to welcome the city's elite, instead announced their presence with an almost accusatory clarity to the indifferent patrons within. A few heads turned, then quickly turned away, their conversations resuming as if a momentary glitch in their perfect world had just occurred. Amara and Ravi stood on the threshold, two silent figures against the backdrop of a vibrant, unforgiving stage. The air was cool against her skin, but a different kind of chill had already settled deep within her bones. The heavy glass door, having chimed its cool, indifferent welcome, swung shut behind Amara and Ravi. Inside, the air was a rich, complex tapestry of aromas, slow-roasted herbs, expensive white wine, and a subtle hint of truffle oil. It was a scent of deliberate luxury, a stark contrast to the dust clinging to Amara's saffron sari. The muted lighting, designed to flatter, felt strangely harsh to Amara's eyes, accustomed to raw, unfiltered light. Every surface gleamed, reflecting her worn image like a distorted mirror. For a moment, they simply stood there, a small, vibrant anomaly. Ravi, his small hand still tightly gripping his stuffed tiger, buried his face a little deeper into Amara's side, intimidated by the hushed reverence. Conversations at nearby tables, which had briefly paused, now resumed, but Amara felt the prickle of eyes, brief and dismissive, before they returned to perfectly plated appetizers. It was a familiar feeling, this subtle yet palpable shift in atmosphere, the silent judgment that seemed to follow them. Then, from behind a towering host stand crafted from dark, gleaming mahogany, emerged Victor Sterling. He was a man carved from the very essence of the Gilded Spoon. Sleek, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, his crisp white shirt a stark canvas for a subtly patterned silk tie. His beard, meticulously trimmed, framed a face that was handsome in a severe, almost unapproachable way. As he moved, there was an almost predatory grace, a silent confidence that filled the space around him. His eyes, the color of cold steel, swept over Amara and Ravi. It was a glance that didn't see people, but rather an inconvenience, an unwelcome stain on his pristine canvas. A flicker of undisguised distaste, fleeting but unmistakable, crossed his perfectly composed face. He paused, a beat too long, allowing the silence to stretch, amplifying their intrusion. "May I help you?" he finally asked, his voice smooth, cultivated, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was a question delivered with the precise enunciation of someone accustomed to absolute control, but edged with an impatience that was barely contained. Amara, clutching Ravi's hand tighter, took a small, hesitant step forward. Her English, a careful tapestry woven from years of necessity and practice, was deliberate, each word chosen with quiet effort. We are very hungry. Do you have a table?" Her voice, though soft, carried the lilting cadences of her native tongue, an accent that, to Victor's ears, seemed to grate like fingernails on a chalkboard. He let out a small, almost imperceptible laugh, a soft, derisive puff of air that barely disturbed his perfect tie. It wasn't an amused sound, but one steeped in condescension. He didn't even bother to consult his reservation book. His gaze remained fixed on Amara, a flicker of something akin to contempt in his eyes. "A table," he repeated, his voice now a little louder, the polite facade cracking to reveal a sharper edge. "My dear woman, this is the Gilded Spoon. We don't cater to walk-ins of your persuasion." The word walk-ins was delivered with a dismissive curl of his lip, and persuasion hung in the air, thick with unspoken judgment. He paused, letting his words sink in, then his eyes flickered down to Ravi. "And your son looks like he's about to shed lint on my pristine floor. Perhaps even track in dirt." Ravi, sensing the icy hostility, whimpered softly. He burrowed closer to Amara's leg, his small hand gripping her sari tighter, seeking the comfort of its familiar fabric. His wide, innocent eyes, reflecting the sparkling chandeliers above, darted fearfully between his mother and the imposing figure of Victor Sterling. The gentle hum of conversation in the restaurant, which had previously been a soothing backdrop, now seemed to falter, then die altogether. The clinking of cutlery ceased. A heavy, almost oppressive silence descended, thick enough to taste. It was a silence that felt less like peace and more like a taut wire, stretched to its absolute limit, threatening to snap and unleash something terrible. Amara felt the weight of every gaze, every unspoken judgment, pressing down on her, crushing her. The exquisite aroma of the food suddenly felt nauseating. Her cheeks burned with a humiliation so profound it brought tears to her eyes, though she fought to keep them unshed. She wished, desperately, for the ground to open up and swallow them whole. This was not the respite she had envisioned. This was a public trial. Victor Sterling's cruel laughter, soft as it was, cut through the silence like a razor. His words, dripping with disdain, hung in the chilled air of the Gilded Spoon, each syllable a fresh wound. "Perhaps there's a less exclusive establishment down the street," he suggested, his voice laced with feigned helpfulness that only amplified his scorn. "One more suited to your rustic tastes." He even gestured vaguely towards the restaurant's entrance, a subtle but unmistakable command for them to leave. Amara's cheeks, already burning from the humiliation, now felt as though they were aflame. Her gaze, unable to meet Victor's icy stare or the curious, fleeting glances of the patrons, dropped to the patterned carpet beneath her worn sandals. A wave of profound shame washed over her, heavier than any physical burden she had ever carried. She felt a desperate, silent apology forming on her lips, a whispered plea to Ravi for bringing them to such a place, for exposing him to such cruelty. His small hand, still clutching hers, trembled slightly, and she felt his body press even closer, seeking refuge in her fragile warmth. She longed to disappear, to simply evaporate into the polished air, to spare her child this public degradation. A hushed tension had indeed fallen over the nearest tables, a palpable ripple spreading outwards from the scene at the entrance. The polite hum of conversation had ceased entirely. Forks poised over delicate pastries and glasses of sparkling water remained untouched. A few patrons, unable to completely ignore the unfolding drama, risked discreet glances in their direction, their expressions a mixture of mild curiosity, vague discomfort, and, in some cases, a carefully cultivated indifference. They quickly averted their eyes if Amara's desperate gaze threatened to meet theirs, as if acknowledging her would somehow implicate them in the ugliness of the moment. Among these patrons, at a table strategically positioned to offer a wide view of the entrance, sat Mrs. Davison. Her silver-streaked dark hair was impeccably styled, her dress elegant but understated, suggesting quiet affluence rather than overt display. Her eyes, however, were what truly set her apart. Kind and discerning, they missed little. She had been in the midst of cutting into a perfectly seared salmon, the flaky pink flesh yielding effortlessly under her knife, when Victor's first condescending words had pierced through the clinking of her fork. She had paused, her hand momentarily frozen, her attention subtly shifting. Mrs. Davison had seen that look before, that particular blend of dismissive arrogance and casual cruelty, etched on the faces of those who held power over the vulnerable. She had encountered it in boardrooms, in sterile waiting rooms, and in impoverished villages across the globe during her extensive humanitarian work. It was a look that always stirred a quiet anger within her, a deep-seated rejection of injustice. She had watched, her expression unreadable, as Amara's shoulders slumped, as Ravi instinctively sought comfort. Victor's final cutting words about rustic tastes resonated particularly strongly, striking a chord of indignation within her. An uncomfortable tension, thick enough to taste like the bitter herbs of a spoiled dish, began to build in the room, pressing down on everyone, demanding to be acknowledged. Mrs. Davison felt it settle heavy and cold in the pit of her stomach. She knew, with a certainty that hummed through her veins, that she could not remain silent. The salmon, once so appealing, now tasted like ash. Mrs. Davison's carefully cultivated calm was a fragile thing, cracking under the pressure of the scene unfolding before her. The perfectly seared salmon lay forgotten on her plate, its delicate aroma now lost amidst the heavy stench of injustice. A quiet fire, long banked, began to stir within her. She had spent decades witnessing dignity stripped away from those deemed other, and this cold, public humiliation was a particularly sharp sting. Victor Sterling's words, rustic tastes, echoed in her mind, a stark reminder of the subtle, insidious cruelty of class and cultural prejudice. She saw the raw shame on Amara's face, the instinctive, childlike fear in Ravi's eyes, and something visceral tightened in her chest. Slowly, deliberately, Mrs. Davison pushed her plate aside. The soft scrape of ceramic against linen was barely audible, but to her, it felt like a declaration. Her appetite had vanished, replaced by a growing sense of indignation and a strange, insistent pull of memory. She had a keen eye for detail, a legacy of years spent observing human behavior in stressful situations, and something about the woman in the saffron sari tugged at a distant, half-forgotten thread in her mind. Her gaze, sharp and assessing, lingered on Amara. She observed the way the woman held herself, despite the visible exhaustion, a quiet dignity, a resilience that even profound weariness couldn't entirely obscure. And then, her eyes landed on the faded saffron of Amara's sari. It wasn't just the color, it was the specific shade, a deep, earthy yellow with hints of orange, and the particular weave of the fabric, a delicate yet durable pattern that spoke of generations of craftsmanship. A flicker, a sensation, like a forgotten scent or a half-heard melody, a memory began to surface from the depths of her mind. She had seen that specific shade, that precise weave, only once before, years ago. The memory was fragmented, buried under layers of countless other experiences, but it was insistent. It was from her time doing humanitarian work in a remote village. Not just any village, but one devastated by a monstrous flood, a place where the line between life and death had been terrifyingly thin. The images rushed back with surprising clarity. Torrential rain, swollen rivers churning with debris, desperate faces. And amidst it all, a woman. A strong, resolute woman who had moved through the devastation with a quiet purpose, her knowledge of the treacherous currents, her understanding of the land, proving invaluable. This woman had saved countless lives, including her own teams, with a bravery that had defied belief, navigating them through rising waters, finding higher ground, comforting the distraught. Mrs. Davison vividly recalled the moment she had been swept away by a sudden surge, clinging to a submerged branch, certain she would be lost. And then, a hand reaching out, strong and steady, pulling her to safety. The hand of that woman. The woman had worn a similar saffron sari, its vibrant color a beacon of hope amidst the muddy despair. It had been a symbol of life, of resilience, of an unyielding spirit in the face of overwhelming tragedy. Was it possible? Could this tired, humiliated woman standing before Victor Sterling, here in this polished, indifferent restaurant, be the same fearless, selfless individual who had moved mountains of water and despair to save lives? The thought was almost too incredible, too coincidental. Mrs. Davison's heart, usually so steady, began to beat faster, a quick, insistent rhythm against her ribs. It wasn't a question of a meal now, or even just of injustice. It was a question of recognition, of a debt owed, of a profound human connection spanning continents and years. She needed to be sure. The silence in The Gilded Spoon deepened, pregnant with unspoken expectations. All eyes were subtly, unconsciously, turning towards Mrs. Davison's table, sensing the shift, the new focal point in the quiet drama. The stage was set, not for a confrontation, but for a revelation. The silent hum of The Gilded Spoon was no longer merely polite. It was tense, expectant. Every head, subtly or overtly, had turned towards Mrs. Davison's table, drawn by the invisible thread of escalating drama. The air, thick with the scent of expensive food, now also carried a palpable weight of unspoken questions. Victor Sterling, sensing a shift in the meticulous order of his restaurant, began to move, his practiced smile momentarily faltering. He was a man who prided himself on control, on the seamless orchestration of his establishment, and any deviation, any ripple in his carefully cultivated calm, was a personal affront. "Is there a problem, madam?" he asked, his voice still smooth, but now with an underlying tremor of impatience, a forced pleasantness that barely masked his irritation. He started to approach Mrs. Davison's table, his eyes flicking from her to Amara, trying to decipher the connection. His primary concern was maintaining the illusion of his restaurant's undisturbed serenity, to quell any potential disruption before it could escalate. Mrs. Davison, however, ignored him completely. Her focus was absolute, her gaze fixed with unwavering intensity on Amara. Victor's voice, usually so commanding, simply dissolved into the background, unheard in the face of her singular purpose. She slowly, deliberately, rose from her chair. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic movement, but a graceful, almost stately ascent that commanded attention. Her eyes, filled with a newfound certainty, locked with Amara's, which were still downcast, still etched with humiliation. "Forgive me," Mrs. Davison began, her voice clear and calm, cutting through the uneasy silence of the dining room like a perfectly tuned bell. It resonated with an authority that wasn't loud or aggressive, but quiet and unyielding. "But have we met before? Perhaps, in a small village, near the river, after the monsoons." Each word was a carefully placed stone, building a bridge across time and circumstance. The last phrase, "after the monsoons," hung in the air, a specific, potent trigger. Amara, startled by the unexpected address, slowly lifted her head. Her eyes, clouded with despair just moments before, now held a flicker of bewilderment, then a fragile spark of recognition. The words, "the floods years ago," escaped her lips in a whispered question, a testament to the magnitude of the memory, something buried deep under layers of pain and survival. Her brow furrowed slightly as she sifted through the dust of time, through the countless faces and tragedies of her past. The sound of her voice, soft yet distinctive, carried the raw emotion of her journey. Mrs. Davison nodded, a warm, genuine smile spreading across her face, radiating a kindness that seemed to melt the icy tension in the air. "Yes," she affirmed, her voice filled with quiet triumph. "You were the one, the woman who guided us, who knew the safe paths through the rising water. You saved my life, and the lives of so many others when the river claimed everything." Her words were not just a statement, they were a lifeline thrown across a vast ocean of time and forgetting. She reached out a hand, not to touch Amara, but as an offering, a gesture of profound respect and gratitude. The silence in the restaurant was no longer just tense, it was captivated, held breathless by the unfolding revelation. Every single person in The Gilded Spoon, from the most discerning diner to the most harried server, was now riveted, their individual worlds shrinking to encompass this singular, astonishing moment. The truth, like a soft whisper, began to echo through the opulent room. This woman, so cruelly dismissed, was no stranger. She was, in fact, a hero. Victor Sterling's carefully constructed composure shattered in that instant. His face, Moments ago a mask of cool disdain, now went pale, a sickly white that contrasted sharply with his meticulously trimmed beard. His eyes darted wildly between Mrs. Davison, a prominent figure in local philanthropic circles, and the rustic woman he had just so cruelly scorned. The chasm between his assumptions and the unfolding reality yawned wide, threatening to swallow his impeccable reputation whole. He stammered, a guttural sound uncharacteristic of his usually smooth demeanor, searching desperately for words, for an explanation, for anything that could salvage this rapidly deteriorating situation. The murmur of conversation in the restaurant, which had been tentatively trying to resume, died completely. It wasn't just a lull, it was an absolute, profound hush that descended upon the Gilded Spoon, thick and heavy, absorbing every sound. The clinking of cutlery, the soft background music, even polite coughs, all vanished. Every eye, every single gaze, was now fixed on the unfolding drama at the entrance. Waiters stood frozen, trays half lifted. Diners, mid-bite, had their forks suspended in air. The atmosphere crackled with a mix of shock, disbelief, and a growing sense of uncomfortable anticipation. This was no longer just a private interaction. It had become a public spectacle, and Mrs. Davison, with her quiet but powerful presence, had just commandeered the stage. Mrs. Davison, sensing the complete attention of the room, turned from Amara, her face now resolute, her silver-streaked hair catching the muted light. Her gaze swept over the stunned patrons, holding each eye briefly, conveying a message of quiet authority and unwavering conviction. "This woman," she announced, her voice resonating with a clear, calm authority that filled every corner of the opulent dining room, "is a hero. A true hero." There was no dramatics, no shouting, just the undeniable power of truth. She risked her life to save strangers, myself included, during a devastating natural disaster. She navigated treacherous waters, she provided guidance, she offered hope when all seemed lost. Her words painted a vivid picture, contrasting sharply with Victor's earlier dismissiveness. The emphasis on risked her life and saved strangers underscored the immense, selfless courage Amara had displayed. A collective gasp, soft yet audible, rippled through the dining room. It was a sound of astonishment, of dawning realization, of sudden, profound shame for many who had witnessed Victor's earlier behavior. The clinking of cutlery was replaced by an almost reverent silence, broken only by a few hushed whispers as patrons exchanged stunned glances. The air, once heavy with the scent of fine dining and the unspoken judgments of class, now crackled with a different kind of tension, one of awe, of deep respect, and for Victor, a crushing sense of mortification. Heads began to nod, slowly at first, then more emphatically, as the weight of Mrs. Davison's words settled upon the room. The narrative had irrevocably shifted. The rustic woman was now revealed as someone extraordinary, a beacon of courage, and the once impeccable owner of the Gilded Spoon was exposed in his ugly prejudice. The silence wasn't just respectful, it was charged, demanding a reckoning that felt almost inevitable. This story of Amara shows just how important dignity and standing up against prejudice really is. What would you have done in Amara's place? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts.